You're listening to Tales from the Ridge. Season 2, Episode 1, The Red Ghost.
Bonnie Gunn wiped dewy sweat from her brow as she bent over the stove, the wooden spoon in her hand giving a dull clunk as she stirred. There was not even a wisp of breeze today, and the still red dirt of Messier 1 practically glowed with heat. "Trix, I've got breakfast here if you're wanting it," she shouted out the open window. There was movement around the laundry line as Trix poked her head around a sheet she had been hanging. "Thanks, I'll be in just a minute," said the other housewife. Her curly blonde hair stuck out at odd angles, a few tacked to her brow from her sweat. Bonnie hummed to herself as she set a plate of scrambled eggs and juice from dried concentrate on the table. She lathered her own piece of toast generously with the fresh butter that they were so lucky to have out here on the range. She'd have to give their dairy cows some extra grains today as a thank you for the boon. Just as she was about to close her lips over the slice of bread, the dogs began to bark. Not the joyous excitement they gave off as the men returned home. No, this was something different. The barking turned to anxious growling as Bonnie scampered to the screened front door. "Trix!" Before Bonnie could even finish the thought, a blood-curdling scream joined the sound of the dogs, whose barking had moved toward the laundry line. Bonnie ran through the house, toward the window overlooking the backyard. A gigantic shadow moved through the sheets and clothes. Smaller shapes where the dogs harangued it, darting in and out. All the while, her friends' cries of terror echoed loudly through the house. "Trix!" Bonnie screamed out at the yard. There was no answer. Bonnie's heart pattered violently in her chest. "Come on, Trixie, answer me!" One of the dogs gave a painful yip, followed by a deathly silence, as the others scattered back around the house, away from the laundry, barking turning to anxious whines. The yard grew still, and Bonnie rushed to the front door, throwing it shut with a bang and sliding the bolt closed. She took the rifle that sat beside it and sank down, feeling the grain of the wood against her back. Hot tears sprang up at the corners of her eyes as she sat there and waited. Waited for a sound, the men coming home, anything. The quiet that met her was agonizing. There was a low rumble that accompanied the herds coming home. Bonnie was pulled from the stupor of her fear by that sound. She dared to open the front door, facing the outside world through the screen. "Fritz!" she called out over the lowing cattle. "Rod!" The men appeared on horses, caked with red dust as they moved the cattle into the night corral. Bonnie ran out into the yard, her hands gripped tightly around the rifle. "Boys!" she cried, the tears streaming down her cheeks again. Fritz's dark-haired head jerked toward her at the tone of her voice, and he urged his tired horse toward his wife. "Hey, he said, hopping down and taking her frantic form in his arms. Shh. What's wrong? I don't know for sure. Something came into the yard, and it had the dogs going, and Trix, she won't answer me. Oh God, I think something's happened to her, Fritz. At her babbling, Rod kicked his horse into a run and moved around the house. In a moment, they heard his own anguished cry. Bonnie shoved her hands over her eyes and sank down to the ground. Oh no. Oh God, forgive me, Trixie, she sobbed as Fritz took off at a run to see what had happened. Bonnie pulled herself to her feet and struggled after them, her lungs hiccuping. She could hear Rod now, his wild crying echoing off the red rocks around them. As she reached the side of the house, Fritz appeared, pulling her tightly against his chest. I can't let you look at this, Bonnie, he said in a rough whisper. Please, don't look. Let me handle this. Go back in the house until I call for you. What's happened? Bonnie pulled his dusty shirt into her hands, fists curling the fabric between her fingers. What's happened to Trixie? Something got her, was all Fritz managed to say. It's bad, Bon. Please, just go back in the house now. Despite the itch in her brain that demanded her horrified curiosity be satisfied, Bonnie listened to her husband and stumbled back into the house. She sank to the kitchen floor, her body stiff with a worn-away fear that left her muscles aching. She saw Fritz through the window, popping a sheet off of the line and bending over. Rod was mumbling something to the other man through his tears, the rough sound of his voice like a knife in Bonnie's heart. It was unknowable to her how much time had passed. She only knew that as the sun began to dip down over the horizon and the large purple moon of Messier 1 rose in the sky, her legs had gone numb and her breath shallow. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his clothes damp with blood in a few places. Bonnie stood quickly, her head dizzy with the sudden movement. Are you hurt? She asked breathlessly as she rushed to him. It ain't my blood, Bon. Oh, she said softly in realization. Oh. It was the red ghost, Fritz said as he pulled off his shirt. What? Bonnie asked in disbelief. You can't be serious. She was ravaged, Bon. Ain't no natural animal what did that. Fritz splashed cool water on his face from the bucket next to the sink. He took a bar of soap in his hands and began to lather his arms, the suds turning pink with blood. I found some red hair, fur, I don't know, stuck on the fence out there. It got one of the dogs, too. Where's Rod? Bonnie asked. Sitting next to his wife's grave, Fritz said after a long pause. What are we going to do? Bonnie finally murmured. I'm going to go into town, see if I can drum up a posse to go after that thing. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. I can't... He finally broke a little, his voice catching in his throat. I can't lose you to it. I won't. Let me come with you. To town, I mean. Bonnie moved to him, handing him a dishcloth to dry his arms. Fritz agreed hesitantly. Let's get Rod inside. Bonnie found a new well of strength somewhere beneath the layers of pain and fear. We can't let him out there all alone while we're gone. Fritz nodded and headed back outside to retrieve his best friend. Bonnie prepared herself for the ride, tying back her hair and removing her apron. It wasn't long before the men returned, and she and Fritz headed out to the horses, still tied where they had been left near the cattle. As Fritz adjusted the stirrups to Bonnie's height, she gently patted Rod's mare, Matilda, on the neck, running her fingers through the horse's golden mane. The husband and wife swung up into the saddle and kicked off toward town, the vast open sky glittering with galaxies above them. The ride to town seemed to take no time. Even at night, it was rowdy with life. Can-can music drifted over the warm breeze that greeted them, and Bonnie's head turned towards its source, Tombstone Saloon. She glanced toward Fritz and saw the stoic expression fixed upon his features. "What are we going to do? Who do we even go to for help?" she asked, urging her horse up beside his. "I hadn't really thought that far ahead, Bon, if I'm honest." Somehow the look of determination on his face did not waver. "We can't afford to pay any muscle. Who in this town, of all places, is going to help us out of the goodness of their heart?" Bonnie's voice began to tighten with anxiety. Fritz didn't answer, and Bonnie pushed her horse toward the saloon. Her husband called out after her as she trotted through a drunk gaggle of Califera. The latter waved angry exoskeleton limbs at her. She jumped from the saddle, tying off Matilda at the post outside next to hover bikes and other more mechanical means of transportation. Bonnie pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, immediately greeted by the sight of a handful of women on its stage, swirling their skirts in a dizzying array. The player piano was loud, yet barely audible over the shouted conversations around her. With a deep breath through her nose, Bonnie strode toward the stage. No one seemed to take any notice of her as she climbed up onto the platform, her eyes straining against the footlights that now beamed directly at her. "Listen up!" Bonnie shouted as the can-can girls around her began to slow their dance and cast her odd looks. The sound in the bar did not diminish. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face going chalk white as he found his wife in the crowd. Bonnie sank to her knees and snagged the shock pistol from the holster of a patron near the stage. The man shouted something unintelligible at her. Bonnie's heart skipped a beat, and then she shot the gun straight up into the air, the sound exploding through the room as a light fixture above her burst into glass and sparks. Tombstone Saloon went eerily quiet almost immediately as hundreds of eyes, not all human, turned to gaze at her with dangerous curiosity. "I said listen up," Bonnie said, though her voice cracked a bit. "The red ghost has been terrorizing our farmstead unhindered, and I know it's caused more than a few problems for the folks of this town, but tonight..." Her voice finally broke as hot tears streamed down Bonnie's face. "Tonight, it took my best friend, and I can't stand for it any longer. We don't have any money to pay, and we don't have any guns to spare, but we need help taking this beast down." She looked around the saloon at the hardened faces that gazed at her. "Please," she added weakly. As her body began to tremble at the thought of what she had just done, a few of the dancers neared her. They wrapped comforting arms around her, murmuring reassurances as they helped Bonnie sit at the edge of the stage. The patron she had stolen the gun from took it back roughly, his face impatient. Fritz pushed through the crowd, his hat askew by the time he arrived at her side. A bevy of conversation inundated the air as the rough patrons of the saloon considered her plight. Somehow, over the sound, the tinkle of spurs caught her ear, and Bonnie looked up as a pair of black boots stopped before her. She followed the black pants, shirt, and duster up to the red bandana and the deep brown face above it. "My crew and I will be happy to help," said the woman in black. Her mahogany eyes were warm and gentle as they observed her. "Thank you," said Bonnie in her breathless reply. It's going to be dangerous. Are you... The woman sank down in front of Bonnie on one knee, her duster exposing the shock pistol at her side. How about we take this conversation outside, and you tell me more about this red ghost, the gunslinger said softly. Fritz took Bonnie's hand, and together they followed the woman in black outside to the wooden planks that served as sidewalks. Two human men, twins in fact, followed them out of the saloon and were quickly joined by another human woman and a formidable-looking female jauntar. I'm Cash Guthrie, said the woman in black, and this is my crew. Introduce yourselves now, be polite, said the gunslinger. Barker, said one of the twins. Boone, said the other. I'm June, said the other woman, and that was some entrance you made back there, she added, impressed. Tack, said the jauntar, with a broad smile that was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. Wait, Cash, began Fritz. I'm sure my reputation precedes me, said Cash Guthrie, with a smile that notched in one cheek. You heard the part where we can't pay you, right? Fritz added. I'm bored, chimed in June Guthrie. Solving a ghost mystery sounds like fun. A woman is dead, June, Cash chided. All right. Sorry, said June, with a childlike grimace. Let's start at your farmstead. Best to track the thing from there, Cash said, indicating the horses tied up outside the saloon. With a still dazzled expression, Fritz managed to swing up in the saddle as Cash's crew hopped onto shiny black Haas motorbikes. Bonnie watched them for a moment and climbed up into Matilda's saddle. She dug her heels into the horse's side, and Matilda took off at a canter, once again sentients shouting at her as they stepped out of the way of the animal. At the edge of town, she pushed the mare into a gallop. The red dust of Messier 1 clouded around the horse's hooves as she rode into the face of the purple moon back toward home. I'll kill that beast, Trixie, she said, over the rush of the wind, the hover bikes behind her drowning out her words. A third batch of tears left thin tracks in the dirt, streaking her cheeks. If I have to do it with my bare hands, I will. I swear, I will.
Thanks so much for listening to Tales from the Ridge. If you didn't know, I named characters after my patrons. There were no less than 3 in this episode. So if you want to get on that, join my Patreon. I couldn't do it without your support. Lisa, Jeff, Erica, Rain, Bonnie, Mara, Rachel, AB, Robert, Claire, Susasaurus, Matthew, Taysom, Vicky, Michael, Willow, Jill, Orsoya, Franchon, Fritz, Rodney, Andrew, Megan, Kira, Katie, Camille, Emily, Andy, and Kat. And as usual, thanks for listening.
Greeted by the sight of a handful of women I got a handful of women.